you guys think about that?
My initial reaction is that when I think about Ida B. Wells and some of the other women that were mentioned, like I said, I mean, I think what would be equivalent is people who put their life on the line. And the people that I thought of during that section was Assata Shakur and Angela Davis. I think, you know, are a little bit closer to, you know, being willing to be ostracized, criticized, maligned, and, you know, actually being willing to lose everything for what they believed in. Some of the other people that were mentioned have done great things and have, you know, propelled other people's careers, but it was maybe a little bit more in a business way or in a nonviolent way, or you know, just other tactics were used, and I think all of them are important.
Did you guys see the mixtapes? The documentary? Some Swedish guy shot this footage back in the '60s. When you mentioned Angela Davis, I thought about. I saw part of it. I saw most of it last night, and she had some very profound things. That's one of her naturals, was about as big as you know, both of our heads. But she had some really profound things to say about. The guy was interviewing her about violence, and she said, "Well, what do you think about something concerning what the Black Panthers were about?" And then she said, "I can't believe you're asking me that." And then she listed the 16th Street Baptist Church in Alabama, and she listed a bunch of other things, maybe others, and a bunch of violent acts where black people were killed. And she said, "You should be asking me about that. You know, you're asking me about the Panthers." So anyway, it's a really interesting piece. If you get a chance to see it, it ran on public television last night on mixtapes.
Well, there's a name that I'd like to add that's not mentioned enough, and that's Ella Baker.
Yeah,
and I would argue that Ella Baker's influence is probably as great as that of Ida B. Wells. In large part, one of the things that I'd say is a major legacy of Wells is that she's one of the first people to have a comprehensive understanding of oppression. So she connected the oppression of women, racial oppression, class oppression, and you see that activism in her whole life. You see the same thing with Baker as well. Baker understood really early on that the civil rights movement was dominated by men. She challenged those men, which is certainly in the tradition of Ida B. Wells. She was key in the formation of SNCC, encouraged the young people to form their own organizations and have them come from the community. And ended up being an inspiration for women's activism across the board afterwards. So my contribution would be Ella Baker to that list.
One of the things that's interesting about your great-great-grandmother was, as I was reading, we haven't mentioned her husband, Mr. Barnett, who was a newspaper publisher, in fact. But it was interesting to see that when she was 33 years old when she got married, and there were people who thought, okay, this is not good because she's going to have to devote her time to being a full-time mother and homemaker, and so this is bad for the activist movement. Not involved, which didn't turn out to be true. She continued to do her work, and she did something that probably, I guess, one of the first women to actually do that, and is to keep her maiden name as well as taking on her married name. She was pretty progressive.
Yeah, well, and he was too.
Yeah, well, obviously.
I mean, that's one of the things that I find to be so interesting, and actually pretty inspiring for me as a female. You know, all these different messages about what you should be and, you know, what is considered to be attractive or whatever, and the fact that she found somebody who accepted her exactly the way she was, I found as a female to be inspiring. And it is interesting if you Google, you know, Ferdinand Barnett, pretty much what you find is husband of Ida. So it's really, I mean, even today, it's like he doesn't have his real own identity in the full capacity that I think he deserves. But he was mostly an attorney,
right?
And he owned a newspaper.
Came to her aid in a situation too.
So if you're just not joining us, you're listening to the Barbershop Show on Buffalo 89.5 FM. Today we're talking about hometown hero and civil rights pioneer Ida B. Wells. You can join our conversation by giving us a ring at 888-635-1112. That's 888-635-1112. You can also tweet the show and follow the conversation at #Reporter. Comments on Buffalo's Facebook page.
You know, as we talk about the situation in Chicago with the Columbia World Exposition, that was one of the major things that she was involved in terms of the pamphlets and also the move to boycott. But there were other things that your great-grandmother did here in Chicago in relationship to African Americans, blacks in housing, and some other things that she saw that were problems, and she was very aggressive about becoming involved with, which kind of been interesting to the political landscape here in Chicago. A black woman making some noise. Did you recount that when you look at the history of her involvement?
I recount more the effort that went behind establishing the Ida B. Wells homes. I don't know as much about her efforts in particular, but one of the things that certainly happened with the establishment of the Ida B. Wells homes, that was one of the few times that the black political establishment came together with the journalistic establishment, came together with the civil rights establishment to make that happen, because it was desperately needed. And it's really inspiring to see how so many people rallied behind establishing those homes in her name. And actually, I think that points to the legacy of the work that she had done. But maybe you could speak better to the specific work that she had done in housing.
Oh, well, at the time, the YMCA, the Young Men's Christian Association, was providing housing, temporary housing for migrants who were coming to Chicago and didn't have a place to live and needed some job training. And the Young Men's Christian Association turned away African American men, which I find to be ironic, considering it was a Christian association. And so Ida felt that was unacceptable and decided basically to open her own version of what the services that the Y were providing at that time. And it was named the Negro Fellowship League. And so basically they did the same thing. They provided housing for, there was, we all know there was a massive migration of African Americans that came from the South to the North. And a lot of those people came, they did not have a lot of skills that were available, that were useful in the urban area because they were coming from an agricultural background. And they didn't have a place to live. So that's what she provided and gave some job training. And I don't know if she gave job placement, but it was a bridge for the people, because a lot of them ended up either homeless or involved in some things that were not necessarily positive activities. And she knew it was because they were, shunned and didn't have the proper support system that would be helpful to them.
What would she say? Because we know that with public housing under the CHA's plan for transformation, obviously they weren't kept in good condition and they had to be torn down, primarily the high-rises. What would she say if she were around today about what happened with those homes, knowing her original intent to provide housing in a fair and equitable way?
Oh, wow. It's always hard for me to guess what she would say about certain things, but I guess basically, based on her value system, I think it would be sort of two-pronged. One is for African Americans to take responsibility for themselves. She was a big proponent of that, and if you live in a location, you need to take care of your own home. So, I think that she would have that as one of her thoughts about it. Because African Americans lived there, then why didn't the community, the people who lived there, take control of their own home and their own neighborhood? And not to say that they didn't, but I think that would be one thing that she would look into, like what happened with the actual residents and how they manage their own space. But in addition to that, just this sort of structural difference in how housing has been maintained in predominantly non-black communities versus predominantly black communities. There is pretty much a structural, difference in policies. So I think it would sort of be two ways that she would examine the situation.
I think early on, though, the maintenance of public housing was pretty good. It didn't get awful until into the 60s.
Early 60s.
Into the 60s, yeah. What's also interesting, though, backtracking a bit too, was that the first public housing, I think, in Chicago was around the late 30s, around 38 or so, and there were 3 such projects before the Ida B. Wells. The other 3 were primarily white. I think one of them had like maybe 2% of the people were of people of color, but all 3 were primarily for white people.
Well, people don't understand that public housing in its origins were for working class whites. And African Americans had to advocate to get in on that process. Now, there's always that sort of situation that once African Americans start doing well in various institutions, the rules change. And right when African Americans started getting the housing projects, you began to see the utilization of FHA loans, redlining, and the GI Bill, which allowed many white ethnics to move into the suburbs. And at the same time as those policies develop, then the money starts getting drained out of the housing projects too. Coincidentally,
Yeah, that was around the 70s, I think.
well, the draining starts as early as the 1960s, as early as 1960s. 1950s, African Americans who are in housing projects are often very assertive as far as the community is concerned. They policed who lived in there. The educational systems were doing pretty well. But in the early 60s, you begin seeing money getting pulled out of those projects. And at the same time, you begin to see the sort of expansion of redlining and segregation in the suburbs as well.
And of course, reverse redlining.
Yeah, and I think the other thing has to do with the shape of the buildings. I mean, these are all low-rise buildings, including Ivy Wells, that particular housing project. And later on, you know, even with Robert Taylor later on, in the beginning, the buildings were fairly well kept in the 50s, late 40s, early 50s. And as you point out, it wasn't until the 60s that things began to really get bad. But with the low-rise housing, I think it probably took longer for it to turn.
Well, I mean, what's interesting, people don't know that Mayor Daley actually did not want high-rise housing. You couldn't get low-rise housing because the federal government would not approve the funds for that. So that was why the high-rise housing was built. But also, in answer to your question, I also think Ida B. Wells would simply be shocked by the population size of African Americans in Chicago right now, and also the nature of the segregation. Because even when she was here, African Americans were more spread throughout the city. That segregation is something that increased over the years, and I'm not even sure if she would recognize the shape of the city as it is now with such intense segregation on the south side.
Well, she was so attuned to politics, she would probably understand how that happened to come about, locking people in, a voting block, and so it was very political. We're going to take a little break here. Keep it tuned to the Barbershop Show on Vocalo 89.5 FM at vocalo.org. Coming up after the break, plans to commemorate Ida B. Wells with a monument in the new residential development where the Ida B. Wells housing project once stood. We'll be right back.